All right, give me 30 seconds and then I'll be ready.
Okay.
Let this one on here. Here we go. Okay. You ready?
Mhm. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. William Curtis, and we want to thank you for joining us tonight for a very exciting conversation that really introduces a new book that I think is going to be very pertinent and relevant for everybody to have on their shelf. And I've been privileged to pastor Dr. Tanya Tinsley and consider her a quote unquote daughter in ministry. So I was asked and humbled to have been asked to kind of guide a conversation tonight. My job is easy because I do less of the talking so that you can hear more about where this book comes from and what was the impetus behind it. It's entitled Four Quarters, a cultural and developmental approach to transforming your spiritual autobiography. Heavy title, but trust me when I tell you, it's going to be the kind of book you need to understand who you are in God. So one, I want to say hey to Dr. Tanya Tinsley, and then we're going to go right into our questions. So Dr. T, good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you. And thank you, Pastor Curtis, for being here tonight. And thank you for your support with the book, Four Quarters. And thank you so much for also writing the foreword for the book.
Well, I know that you're really, really excited. Every first-time author, well, you've been in journals and periodicals and stuff, and you've done a lot of inclusions to literature that is out there in the field of therapy and psychology, but the privilege to have your own book. Now, all theology starts with context, yes, and all writing starts with its identification with the author. Talk about where the impetus of the book came from. How was it developed? How was it birthed in you?
Absolutely. Great question. And I think to really talk about the impetus for the book and how it was birthed, we got to go back a few years because the spiritual autobiography was part of a requirement at United Theological Seminary as part of my doctor of ministry. However, before even understanding that, we have to go back to 2007. I heard you preaching and talking about mental health and weaving mental health with theology and biblical principles. I posed to you about a counseling ministry. We talked about all of that. Fast forward in 2009, you said to me, now that we have this counseling ministry, you know you need to strengthen your foundation in theological principles and biblical passages. And I really kind of looked at you, but in my mind, I was like, yeah, right, I'm not going back to school. Well, God has a way of getting us to where he wants us. And he called me more to ministry and more beyond that of counseling. And that's how I ended up at United Theological Seminary. I really didn't want to go back to get another doctorate. I kind of went kicking and screaming, but I also wanted to be obedient to God's call. And the first semester, we had to write this spiritual autobiography. Now, I really thought going in, it was going to be easy. I was like, I'm a counselor. As part of my counseling program, it's all about self-awareness. Absolutely not. And it was very challenging because I really had to go deeper to see where God's hand prints and where he was guiding me as part of my life. And as I go back into this spiritual autobiography, I realized God has been with me from birth to the time I wrote the book and currently today. And he has been guiding me. Sometimes I would listen, sometimes I didn't, but as part of the spiritual autobiography, I really came to understand God's role in my life. 2 years ago, I lost my biological father. I have journaled since I've been a child. Back then it was called a diary. but I started journaling. And then that's when God spoke to me to share my thoughts about the spiritual autobiography into a book to help other people. So I was sitting in counseling, and I realized that all of my clients at Mount Ararat Counseling Center in my private practice open up and are transparent with me. And I wanted to be able to use my journey to open up and guide people that I work with, past, present, and future.
So in the doctoral process, we know that that spiritual autobiography is important because it is then wed or synergized with what we would call a context paper. And taking that spiritual autobiography and that context paper, it's the ability to strain out of that what are the salient points of your spiritual journey. How does that match the context where God has planted you and placed you? And what are the synergies that come out of that? So some might think it's interesting, 4 quarters. And many people don't know your sports background. So talk a minute about the title of the book, 4 quarters, where that comes from, and what about your background kind of gave birth to that particular title?
Absolutely. So first, one of the things I think it's really important, and it took me a minute to get, but our D-Men project stems from the marriage of our context of where we are, Mount Ararat Baptist Church, but my own context. I had this idea of what I was going to do, but I had to kind of really allow God to open up who I was, because I truly believe by going through this, I was able to understand that my D-Men project was really about me, and then healing me and going back into those same contexts and helping other people. So as I started reflecting on me and my spiritual autobiography, I wanted to really understand it from a cultural perspective, because when I was talking to some of my cohort members and D-Men colleagues, all of our stories, we talked about culture and we had to talk about development. And I believe that even those points of crisis and the crisis of faith, it's developmental. And oftentimes, even myself and my clients and those in ministry that I'm mentoring will say, well, I don't understand why this crisis had to happen to me. And a crisis is an opportunity for growth. But I also wanted to say that developmentally, when we talk about developmental theories, a crisis is an opportunity for growth developmentally. So it was really important for me to identify the 4 quarters as developmental stages and help people to understand those crises of faith, the crises that somebody may have experienced, was really normal reactions to these extraordinary events that somebody may have faced throughout their life.
Okay, and the 4 quarters were to match what particular sport?
Absolutely. So we talk about basketball. So I really believe that me playing basketball and starting in the first quarter was kind of a protection for me. So oftentimes when people play sports, I do a lot of work with athletes, but I had to understand myself. Playing basketball was a self-protective factor. It kept me safe. It kept me involved in a group. It helped me to understand healthy relationships with my teammates and my coaches. And so what I did is I took this whole concept of basketball. We have a pregame, we have the 4 quarters, we have an overtime, and we have a post game. So in the book, the pregame is really to understand the basis for the spiritual autobiography. Each of the 4 quarters represent a developmental stage. So first quarter represents from birth until 12 years old. Second quarter is 13 until about 20, 21. Then we have adulthood. I kind of mixed the third quarter with young adulthood and middle adulthood. And then the fourth quarter is older adulthood. And we know now developmentally, older adulthood could go all the way up until 100 years old. So then that's where this overtime comes in. In between the first 2 quarters and the last 2 quarters, we have a timeout. So it is really important. People can rush through the book and rush through reading about the development and the different developmental tasks and what God's purpose is. But I needed to have writing prompts after each quarter. and also at halftime and the post game, for people to take time to really think about their spiritual autobiography and their journey. So within each quarter, they're thinking about their life, because we all may have some unfinished business that we need to finish, and it's never too late to finish that. So as people are reflecting earlier quarters, they can kind of realize, where was God involved in my life? Is there some areas I need to work through to really understand where I am in ministry today, where I am in counseling today, or whatever helping profession that somebody is in?
Okay, so I'm gonna ask another question, but I know you have Facebook viewers and they may have questions as we're going along. So we're gonna ask them if they have questions to post them there, and it'll give Dr. T a chance to answer some of them. And if you're on Zoom, you can drop it into the chat room and we'll be able to try to pick them up at some point and take some time out for some questions. But let's drill down for a minute. So describe for a person some of the environment of pregame.
Mm-hmm. So the pregame, when we talk about the spiritual autobiography, I had a quote that I kind of wanted to share from the pregame. So pregame, I start off with a scripture, and I start off with Psalm 139. Lord, you have examined me, you know when I sit down and when I stand up. So really, God knows who we are. And our job is to really kind of understand how God is molding us and how he is forming us, and allowing those flaws that we might have, those imperfections that we may have, to really understand that it's part of our brokenness, it's part of who we are going into ministry. But how do we use those imperfections, and how do we use the brokenness to really understand how God is forming us? And I really want people to also understand in the pregame, I use Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans and thoughts that I have for you, says the Lord, plans for peace and well-being and not disaster, to give you a future and a hope. It's when we talk about a crisis, we could say it is a time for danger, but it can be an opportunity for growth. God does not want us to be dealing with danger and disaster. He wants us to grow, and he wants us to be blessed. So a spiritual autobiography, as discussed in the pregame, is the story of significant events, peoples, and places that have influenced your relationship with God, and it relates to how God's interaction has been in your life. So the pregame is just outlining what does the spiritual autobiography entail, and it's outlining that people will really focus on those points of crisis, of faith that were experienced during that quarter, God's presence at those points, and the outcomes of growth that the crisis stimulated.
So if I hear you correctly, if a person is thinking about where I insert myself in the journey of this book, the pregame is my honest acceptance of the totality of who I am and what I bring to the game of life, and trusting that wherever I'm going to fit in this competitive world that we're going to use in terminology as the game of life, I got to be okay that God brings me to the game with everything that I am, and that's okay for the journey that's in front of me. Am I hearing that correctly?
You are absolutely hearing that correctly. And I think by using the sports metaphors, we're no different than what Paul did in the New Testament. When Paul was in Corinth, he had to understand his congregants, and he had to understand those that he was ministering to. They understood the language of sports. So how can we use sports to understand our fullness of who we are, but also to understand ourselves and our faith journey and our faith maturity?
So how does the pregame differentiate from the first quarter?
So the first quarter now is really focusing specifically on, now we talked about the pregame is the whole picture. Now each quarter is going to break down that whole picture. So the first quarter is really focusing on conception to birth to 12 years old. So really understanding developmentally the role of family and socialization, to understand the role of the school, understanding how a person is forming their identity during that stage, and understanding that your socialization, whether good, bad, or indifferent, is part of understanding that spiritual autobiography.
Now, let's wed for a minute, because you and I have spent significant time talking about why there is this ambivalence, and maybe for some this fear about wedding therapy and the psychological field with theology and a person's spirituality. So why is it important for a person theologically to understand how important their developmental stage was to who they are in their journey of faith?
Absolutely. So I'm going to take what you just said, your journey of faith. And we could talk about faith being developmental, and we could talk about faith being growth oriented. And so really having to understand who we are as a person, to understand who we are spiritually, and understand us as Christian beings, and understanding that it's developmental, and that sometimes it's those crises that we may face that's going to help us to grow to another level in our faith. And so it's really important to understand ourselves, mind, body, and spirit. So we got to understand ourselves and what's going on in our mind, and how we think, and how we think about experiences of how we've been socialized in our family, with our friends, in the schools. We have to understand how we think about those things that may have happened to us that we don't have control over. But we also have to understand how those things can impact us physically, and all of that goes together. So when we talk about total wellness, we're talking about mind, body, spirit. We're talking about using that cumulatively for our faith development.
Yeah, I can think of a particular passage where Jesus's parents are on their way home from the feast, and Jesus disappears and is found in the temple as some would say a 12, 13-year-old. And when they discover him, he says, "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business?" It was a precursor to the kind of ministry he was going to offer later on. And it started in what you would call that first quarter of life, and the wedding of who he is in a Jewish culture and who he is as the Son of God. So for the average person, what would you say is the most important takeaway? If they dive into your book, what's the most important takeaway for a person that prompts them to go back and dig up who they are and how they've come to who they are, in order to understand really what God is doing, your spiritual gifts, the ministry that God has given you, the call that God has put upon your life? Why is that so important?
It's really important because, again, when we think about what our focus is on in our ministry, it's often to that place that we have come from. And if we are going to be effective in our ministry, and effective with preaching the word, spreading the gospel, ministering to people, we kind of have to have some type of understanding of that context. So part of it is, when you go back into those contexts, if you have not allowed yourself to heal and transform, today you can allow yourself to heal and transform, to know that, it says all things will work out for the good of those who love the Lord and have been called towards it for his purpose. So instead of saying, why did this happen to me? How do I use this to be able to be of service to other people?
Okay, that's real good. So now distinguish for me the difference between first quarter and second quarter.
So now second quarter, that is from 12 years old. And in the books, depending on development, some theories say adolescents go until 20, 21. I really focused it on 12 to 18. That's adolescence, is this time where I'm really trying to understand my identity. There could be role confusion, my thoughts. I'm really starting to think about, if this happens now, I can deductively think, if I do this now, this will happen later on. This is where I'm starting to prepare for life out of high school, life out of adolescence. So really trying to make sense of that period and what that means for the adulthood stage.
And in your career, how have you found that's translated spiritually? Like, where do you find folk often spiritually in that second quarter?
Absolutely. So if we talk about first quarter, this is a time where a child is developing competence in some area, whether it's academics, music, some extracurricular. So now, whatever that is, God is using that as a way to kind of protect them and guide them. That's what I believe. And so for basketball, I was able to develop as a spiritual and Christian being based on my high school basketball coach. I realized that he was placed in my life to really help me to understand faith and the role of Jesus Christ in my life and who I was as a spiritual and Christian being. So I truly believe during that adolescence time, people are placed in your life, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a mentor, whether it's friends, who will help to guide you to make meaning. Because as we're starting to plan for the future, we're trying to make meaning and make understanding.
So normally in a 4-quarter game, that middle piece between second and third quarter is where you have halftime or a forced timeout. Absolutely. So let's take a moment and talk about, how do you define in the book what a timeout is? So
a timeout is a time where throughout the explanation, so I kind of become a teacher in the book, and I'm teaching you about development. I'm teaching you about culture and how to apply that to your story. The timeouts are for you to just pause. And there's some guided questions to reflect on your life and what you just read, what does that mean for your life? So the timeouts are for you to just take a pause, reflect on what you have read, developmentally, culturally, and apply it to your life.
Yeah, I think that's critical, particularly in a world that is inundated with noise and the constant stream of information. And for all intents and purposes, a word that never really shuts down. That part of spiritual development is what the psalmist calls that Selah, that space and breathing in between verses. And many people stunt their spiritual growth because they think spirituality is this always fast-moving progression and never a chance for recollection and musing and meditating. So talk a little bit more about the timeout. Maybe I'm being selfish, but I'm the one who gets to ask the questions. Absolutely. In the interview. And I think it's critical for people to know how important it is to have these brief selahs in life.
Absolutely. So let me say this, because as I finished this book, I did want just kind of a lay person to read it and give me their thoughts and feedback. And Carmen Jefferson, who you know in Pittsburgh, she said, this is a quick read, but Dr. Tanya slows you down enough to honestly reflect, review, renew, and realize God's purpose for your life without sitting in front of her. And the whole idea of the timeout is to be still, to reflect. I give guided questions, and they're not questions that you're going to answer real quick. You need to take some time to think about it and engage in those questions and engage in the concepts that you're learning to be able to understand your life. Because I think it's really important to understand where we have come from to understand where we are today and where we are going. So those timeouts, they're not designed for you to rush through them. So although the timeouts in a basketball game are quick and you get back into the game, the timeouts in my book are for you to really just slow down, be still, reflect, write. So I really want people to have a journal in the book. I give spaces to write if they want to write in the book, but to really reflect on the questions as it relates to their own personal life.
And since you carry the heavy sports metaphor, we know that growth is not in the workout, it's in the rest.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. It's in the rest, and we got to relax our muscle, we got to relax our brain, but we also have to be able to, there's this thing called post-traumatic growth. So as people are reflecting on their crises, that is an opportunity to reflect on their growth from those crises that they may have experienced. And each crisis throughout the book and each quarter is designed to show how you have grown from those traumatic kind of painful experiences if you truly allow yourself to reflect on those experiences.
Now, what do you say to people who say, I really just don't want to deal with all of that trauma in my past? Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's really important because one, as we are in ministry, as we are in counseling and helping, we got to be aware of our stuff so that we don't harm those that we are hurting. And if I believe you can only minister to, counsel, teach as high as you've allowed yourself to go. So if you want your congregants to go to another level, you got to be willing to go to another level. If you want your clients to go to another level, you have to be willing to go to another level. And you're not going to be able to take somebody else to another level if you haven't allowed yourself to go there.
Now, do you think your book is more for leaders? Is it for lay people? And what's kind of the integration of the two?
So it can be for leaders. So this past January, I did a leadership training at my sister's church in Nebraska, and we used the book to help her leaders to understand where their strengths are in ministry. I have used this book with counseling students. Counseling students, it's really talking about self-awareness and personal awareness. But it's also important for those counseling students that are looking to specialize or integrate spiritual, theological, Christian perspectives. I've also used this with just lay people who are wanting to help other people and to understand their story. So it can be designed for students, it can be designed for leaders, and it can be designed for somebody who's just really trying to understand, where am I supposed to be working with people to be effective? Because if we are about being service to people, we really need to understand where that service is going to be effective.
All right, so halftime is over. Describe third quarter for me.
Okay, and we talked about timeouts, but let me say about halftime, because now people have reflected on those questions from timeout. Halftime is a time to take all of those questions from the timeout and go back and put them all together for the first quarter and the second quarter. And so then as people have really reflected on their first half of their life, they're going into their third quarter, which is 18 years old to 30 years old. During this time, this is where I'm developing intimate relationships with people. I am trying to really be relational at work. I'm really trying to be relational in my ministry, and I'm trying to be relational with other people. So during this time, it's really about who am I now as I relate to other people. Now, in the adolescence, when I said that was time for identity development, oftentimes people struggle in their relationship. And it's hard to be relational and have effective, healthy relationships if you don't know who you are. That is why during adolescence, it happens so quick. That's one of the most busiest times in the lifespan. So today, as adults, it may be important to go back to adolescence to clearly understand who you are, to understand that in early adulthood, how you related to other people, whether they're healthy or unhealthy relationships.
And let me go back because I wanted to ask it before, but I think it begs to be asked now. If I go back and I muse over my life and I unearth some things that have to be dealt with, perhaps they stunted my growth, or God wants to use them as springboards into awareness and epiphanies and theophanies and self-disclosures and the like, what spiritual disciplines do I implore to help me comb through that? And what does healing look like?
Oh, great questions. So spiritual disciplines, I would say prayer, to really pray and ask God, what is it that he wants you to go back and work on? Because remember, when we talk about Psalm 139, he's formed us in our mother's womb. So he knows who we are. And there may have to be some places we have to go back to. So prayer, because he will guide us. And let me just kind of say a point about that. You may or may not remember when I was at the counseling center, I was doing lots of couples counseling, right? And marriage counseling. That is not why I went into counseling. But God had another plan for me. And I could not understand why I was continually getting couples, but it was working. But I also had to reflect on my own self. And part of that process is I had to go back and understand my family dynamics. And I had to understand my family systems to understand, to be able to help those couples to go to another level. So I had to pray about it because I kept asking God, why is it that you want me to work with these couples when I came into counseling to focus on grief and loss? And that is where he led me back to really understand the family systems to be effective with the couples that I'm counseling, whether it was at the counseling ministry or in my practice.
So how does a person, like, so if you're sitting in worship, what happens with the person who's sitting in worship, who is taking your journey? They're trying to understand the four quarters. They're trying to be healthy. They're trying to heal. So I want to ask again, and maybe the question is on the back end. What happens in worship to a person who is very cognizant of this journey? And then I'm gonna ask again, because I always like to push people on this. I think we are very good at unearthing. I think we are equally as fragile in answering the question, what does healing look like?
Right. So now let's get to the healing. I'm going to go to when Jesus was at the pool and he said to the man, wilt thou be made whole? And when we talk about being made whole, we're talking about mind, body, and spirit. And I look at healing not as a destination, but as a process. And so healing happens over time. That's where that growth comes in, because our body and our mind is designed not to take all of the stuff that we unearth all at once, because we're not going to be able to handle that. So healing is a process, but part of it is being made whole. So we know that we talk about healing is you got to get up, you got to be action oriented. You got to be intentional to be able to become whole, mind, body, and spirit. So I look at healing as growth. So remember I said post-traumatic growth. I look at healing as becoming made whole in health and wellness, because one area is going to impact another area. I look at healing as being intentional, and being intentional, engaging in the prayers, engaging in worship, and hearing the word of God. Because as you and I have talked about, when people hear the word of God, it may trigger something that person has to work on and heal to be able to move to another level in their faith.
Okay. Yeah, I want you use the image of the man at the pool, and you tell me if I'm correct. Is healing commensurate to being able to carry your mat no longer with shame, accepting the truth and the reality of what it was, and using it almost now as a bridge between it carrying me before and me carrying it forward?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you are absolutely right, because when we're talking about healing, we can either focus on those external factors that are controlling us, or we can focus on the internal, how we think about something, how we are action oriented, and how we allow our healing to become whole, to be able to move forward and control ourselves. So no longer do you have to be bound by something from the past. Now you can be free to move forward. So when we talk about, and let me also say this with healing. I use in the book this idea of brokenness. And we know that as a result of the fall, we have brokenness of self, which is that guilt to shame. We have brokenness in relationships. So healing is that reconciliation between self, with others, with God, and with creation. And so healing is also our reconciliation is also part of that healing.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's really good, because people will often ask the question, how do I know I'm healed? And healing is not always the absence of those same traumatic remembrances, nor is it the absence of the stress and struggles that are part of everyday common life, but it's the ability to carry them with a different identity,
Absolutely.
the ability to know who I am now
Right.
inside of this struggle and not being ashamed of what it took for me to get there. So I think that's really, really good. And I want to stay there for a minute because I think a lot of people in a culture where the brokenness gets highlighted more than the healing. Once a person has come to a place of restoration, healing, or at least they're confronting it and they're accepting it as part of their journey, in your writing, how does a person continue to develop the energy, the wherewithal, the pathos, I guess we would call it, to keep fighting and chiseling away at it?
Absolutely. I think part of it is, and what I say to when I'm working with my mentees and when I'm working with my clients, sometimes you do have to take a break because when you are in the process of healing, that's the difference. When you are going back to finish unfinished business, that's not like going to the spa or feeling good after the spa. It's working when you don't feel good. So you have to give yourself space to be able to recover from not feeling good, of things being unearthed. I look at, we say healed in past tense, but I want to say healing is transformation. It's a process. So people have to trust the process. And people have to understand that how do you know that you're healed is that it doesn't cause you as much pain as it was the first time around. So
Right,
can
right.
you talk about it where you're no longer triggered as you were initially when it happened? So if I give an example as part of my journey, if you remember, I witnessed that death by suicide, right? I couldn't talk about it without crying every time. But today I can talk about it and use it and help with people and use that traumatic event to be able to help other people.
Now let's take a little commercial break because I know how these Zooms run. How do people access your book? Where can they get it?
Absolutely. So people can get the book pre-order. They can get the link on the Love and Basketball Ministries or on my Facebook page. And if you pre-order from me directly, it's $25. You'll get an autographed copy. And then because we are living in a time of COVID and we have to engage in health and safety, everyone would get a 4/4 mask with the book. And so you can pre-order the book directly from me. Dorrance Publishing out of Pittsburgh. You can pre-order from them and you can get the book from them. And the book will be listed on Amazon anytime now. So you have 3 ways to get the book. But if you order from me, you get an autographed copy.
And if they order from you, where are they going to order it?
They're going to my PayPal. So there's a link that I have posted on Love and Basketball Ministries page. And they're going to PayPal. They will put their address in. They will get a confirmation email from me that I have received their order. And then I will be starting to mail books the week of October 26th.
So on your social media platform, it's Love and Basketball.
Yes.
Okay. So we just wanted to take that little commercial break so that everybody would know here's where you get the book, $25, and you get a mask as well. And what was the other thing you get with it?
You get the mask in the book, autographed book. And so Love and Basketball Ministries on Facebook, Dr. Tanya Tinsley on Twitter, Dr._TMT on Instagram or on LinkedIn. Okay.
So let's go back and let's talk about the 4th quarter so we can be complete. Describe the 4th quarter.
So the 4th quarter, that is where is 30 years old to 60. Now I know that's a wide gap, but that's middle adulthood. And that constitutes that middle adulthood. This is a time where people are giving back to their families, giving back to their communities. They've really understood who they are as and their identity. They've understood how they related to people. Middle adulthood now is this time. If somebody is experiencing a crisis, I just went blank on the word I'm looking for. It used to be called a midlife crisis if somebody was having a crisis during this time. And during this time, people have to go back and really understand who they are, how they relate, so that they can understand where they're going to be effective in service.
Okay, I like it. And do you have an overtime?
We have an overtime, and the overtime is older adults, 60 years old to death. And during that time, it's really focusing on, so developmentally, there is a theory that says older adulthood, this is a time where people look back over their life and they either feel like they have done well or there might be some despair. So this is a time where in the overtime, you're really reflecting on your life, minimizing the amount of despair and really understanding. One of my favorite books is called Falling Upward. And this is a time where you are recognizing all of those crises, the falling down in earlier parts of life is designed for you to be blessed and not have despair in older adulthood.
I wonder where you got that book from.
Oh, I don't know. Somebody named Pastor Curtis.
Yeah, I think that book is so good. It was recommended to me at a critical time by a friend. And what the author does there is he divides life into two halves. So where you do 4 quarters and kind of break it down more, he does these 2 halves of life. And he says to emerge from one half to the other is to go through a death. You call them the traumatic experiences. And I think they are similar. Synonymous actually, and we can't avoid it. To attempt to avoid it is to arrest your own development. It's to deny the journey that God has for you and the gifts that God has placed resident in you. So talk about your excited potential takeaways for a person who reads your book. A person engages it, they pick up the first page, they patiently go through the process of reading the whole book. When they come out of it, let's call it your guarantee. Dr. Tinsley's guarantee is that if you engage this book, you're going to what?
You are going to be more effective in your ministry, whether it's within the 4 walls of the church or with outside the 4 wall, the mortar brick church. And we are living in a time right now that we're outside the mortar brick church. And so you will understand who you are personally, how God has been in your life, even through those points of crises, and how he is using you for the good and wherever he has called you to be. Also, because we live in a society where sports permeates our society, even if you don't like basketball, you've heard about NBA, you've heard about LeBron James, you've heard about the WNBA. So to be able to make connections with sports and how it applies to your life, to really understand how to love yourself, how to love others, and how to be of service to others.
Yeah, I think that's very good. And the whole demon process and you then taking that and making the adjustment to make it practical for a person who is just trying to make it through life, I think is so good. It's for us to understand that spirituality is journey.
Yes.
It's a lifelong journey. And to the degree that you can submit yourself to that journey and trust God that all of these traumatic experiences mixed with all of these euphoric experiences and the relationships that you develop, if you can really look at them through these 4-quarter lenses, you have a chance of doing what Paul says when he gets to the end of his life, or what you would call that overtime period. And he can say, I fought a good fight, I kept the faith, I finished my course. And as a result, I know there's a crown of righteousness laid up and that is in store for me. I want to encourage everybody, if you have any questions, please put those questions on the Facebook chat so we can make sure that we answer some of your questions. I've tried to incorporate those that appeared in the chat room here on Zoom, and thank you for your active participation. And we tried to incorporate all your questions. So get some of that in there. And while Dr. T is looking for some of those questions, let me talk a little bit just for a second about how her writing has really been translated even in her own journey. because I watched a person who, if you asked me what 15 years ago, if her journey through the therapeutic modality would have eventuated in attaining a doctor of ministry degree and engaging ministry and the merging of the therapeutic with the ecclesiastical, many churches have been inviting her to insert her writings and her works into their workshops, not only into their counseling center curriculum, but also into their spiritual development and discipleship curriculum. Many pastors have leaned on her for consultation as to how to not only build counseling ministries, but how to integrate therapy and spirituality. Several counseling centers across the country have done great work after having sound consultation by Dr. Tinsley. So she's proven herself as an expert in the field. She's credentialed to be able to wed the therapeutic and the theological. And I think for anybody who wants to do what Joe Gregory calls that third level reading, and he makes the distinction between first level reading being an author you can pick up from any standard bookstore. Second level reading is from an author who gives him or herself to a topic, but they try to be an expert in multiple topics. And then that third level, that deepest level, is a person who has dedicated their entire life to this one specific constricted and narrowly defined discipline. And Dr. Tinsley has done that when it comes to therapy and theology, which means you're not reading a person who is trying to be a jack of all trades and master of none. You're reading a person who Harry Emerson Fosdick says, all theology is therapeutic. And I really do in many ways believe that. I think all theology is heavily biblical in terms of its conversation, but also heavily therapeutic in terms of the transformation of the mind. And she's done just a great job at dedicating her life to that. And I think that book would be very helpful. So are there any questions that have arisen out of our conversation tonight?
No questions. There's no questions.
Does that mean I am a great interviewer or you're a great interviewee? I don't know which one, but I'll give it to you since it's your book that you're a great interviewee. So we've got maybe 12 minutes left. So let's get really personal. How exciting was it to author a first book?
It's very exciting. I think I mentioned to you, I was also anxious because I'm allowing myself to be transparent in the book, but some anxiety is normal, but I am very excited because having used the book as a framework for some training already, having had people to read it already, it's affirming to know when they tell me it's helped them and helped them to understand where they are and how God has been a part of their life. And that's what's important to me, is to be able to help people to have a higher level of self-awareness and understanding about themselves and about their experiences.
And where do you go from here? So four quarters is now written, and tonight you debut that to the world. What's next?
So I would like to continue providing trainings using this book, going into the churches. I think one of the things you may or may not remember, but it was that spiritual autobiography that was going to keep me from finishing that D-Min program. Mm-hmm. Everybody needs to understand that when you go deep, it's not always going to feel good, but it's going to be for your good and for those that you are helping and ministering to. There are programs that don't require spiritual autobiography, but that doesn't mean that a pastor or a leader can't require it for their team. And so I think that if we can, because you know me about bridging the gap with counseling and theology, if we can't help them, let's not hurt them. And you have to understand what's going on with yourself so that you don't bleed over and potentially harm those that you're trying to help by your lack of awareness of what's happened in your life and those areas that you have not finished. So that's next, doing the trainings. I want to, I thank you. I thank Reverend Dr. Joan Prentice, Dr. Chad White, who was my cohort leader, but also Bishop Mack, Sir Walter Mack. When he was teaching our class about converting our project into a book, I was like, yeah, right, I'm not doing this. I am done writing. Well, he did it again. I just talked to him last week and he asked me the same question, what's next? So I'm probably going to use some same concept of sports metaphors and come up with another book that's bridging the gap with counseling and theology.
All right, so stay tuned, everybody, because some more books are coming. Now, I'm going to ask you a question as an author that I wish had been asked of me. It's a tough question, but I think people who have the privilege of diving into our lives through our print, they need to know this. What do you wish you had had more time to include in that book? I knew it would be tough.
Yeah. Well, I will say this. I started writing this book 2 years ago. There's a lot that has happened in my life that I could include as part of my spiritual journey. So if I were to write a second edition, I would go and add what has happened in the last couple years to help people to understand it is a process and you have to trust the process. We live in life, our lives are like peaks and valleys. So there are going to be times where we're, on the peak and all is going well, but we may have those valley experiences that are designed to really help us help other people.
Yeah, and I've watched you go through some of that with some of the career changes and the transitions from cities and some of the disappointment of promises made that have been broken in some of the places where you really felt strongly about where God was planning you. And the reason I wanted to ask that question is precisely for that, because your life has really epitomized these quarters in the book, not chronologically, but experientially. Absolutely. And it was the very principles that were in the book that I think were helpful. It's like that one author says, you have to eat your own meal and you have to take your own medicine. One title is Eat What You Serve. Right. And I think that was very important. So one, I thank you for allowing me to interview you tonight. Two, I want to say how godly proud I am of what God has done, not only in the book, but in the evolution of Dr. Tanya Tinsley, the therapist, who's become Dr. Tanya Tinsley, also the theologian. And I also want to say to everybody who's viewing and connected, it's a book worth reading. I don't say that often about many, many books. I am a third level criticism kind of person, but I think this book covers persons who are everyday devotional readers and persons who really want to do strong internal work. And I want to strongly endorse the book and pray that you would access it not only for yourself, but for others. And stay tuned, because this is the kind of ministry gift that you've heard from tonight that's going to be repetitive as an author, always giving to us robust information and robust literature that'll be beneficial for us as Christians. So that's my last word, and it's your Zoom. This is your night, so the last word belongs to you.
And I just want to say thank you. As I went back and just kind of reread my book, I started at Mount Ararat when I was entering the third quarter. So having you as my pastor and my experiences, you may remember I lost my brother suddenly and traumatically, and everything from then up until now. But I truly believe you talked about those spiritual disciplines, being in worship, hearing the word. We are designed to be in relationships. So having the relationships that I have with people at Mount Ararat, who I consider my extended family. So I thank you. I thank Mount Ararat Baptist Church. I thank my extended family at the church for being a part of the journey with me during my middle adulthood. And I thank all of you who have joined, who will watch this later, and who have already purchased the book. I am hopeful and prayerful that it will bless you. So thank you all. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via social media or my email. And I want to thank again, Reverend Dr. Joan Prentice, Bishop Sir Walter Mack, Reverend Dr. Robert Jackson III, and Carmen Jefferson for being a part of this process. And one other person that I want to thank that has been very helpful and inspirational and just a support is Lady Pinda James. So I want to thank her as well. Thank you all.
So one more time, they get the book where?
So you can get the book through the PayPal link, where you can find the link on Love and Basketball Ministries Facebook page, my Twitter page, Dr. Tanya Tinsley, my Instagram page, Dr._TMT, or my LinkedIn page. Or you can email me directly, ttinsley@transitions.com, and I can send you the link. Or you can go to Dorrance Publishing website.
All right, everybody get the book, okay? Everybody get it. We want to support authors of our own kind. So thank you, Dr. T.
Thank you, Pastor. Everyone have a good night.